We're back now with Kimberley Strassel, who is a columnist for the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post columnist David Ignatius, plus New York Times White House correspondent Peter Baker and CBS News State Department correspondent Margaret Brennan. You know, once when I was a young reporter covering the Ford White House, and the president called on me at a news conference, and my mind went totally blank. I couldn't think of a question, so I said, what about the Russians? Well, you know, he gave me an answer that made the front page of Peter's newspaper the next day. And the more I think about it, it was a pretty good question. Peter, what about the Russians? What happens now?
It's a great question. It's a universal question, one that we'll be asking not just today, but for many weeks to come. Look, the Russians are put in a bad position here because they're now on the defensive in the world, and what President Obama clearly hopes is the reluctance that Europeans and others around the world have shown toward a tougher stance toward Moscow will be changed as a result of the international outrage. It's not just in Ukraine anymore. It's 192 dead Dutch passengers. It's people in Australia, Malaysia, around the world who have now been brought into this one-time local conflict. And the question is, how does Russia respond to it? And it's really not clear at this point.
What do you think, David? I mean, what if we determine beyond a reasonable doubt, and I'm beginning to wonder how much more evidence they need here, that it was Russia that was directly responsible for this? At least they put everything in place. Maybe there wasn't a Russian there to say, pull the trigger.
I thought we heard Secretary Kerry pretty close to that point this morning on your show, and it seemed clear they haven't decided yet what the next U.S. step would be. I think for now, they're putting a question to President Putin. They're saying, you must stop this double game in which you talk about a resolution of this crisis and you continue to pump weapons into irresponsible, reckless separatists. You have to be, as Secretary Kerry said, you have to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. If Putin steps away, and we can only imagine what he's thinking in retreat now about this mess that he's caught himself in, if he steps away, then new diplomatic doors open up. If he doesn't, and that's really the question you're asking, what steps are then taken? I think they're going to be driven by Europe. I mean, I think the Dutch Prime Minister, when he calls the behavior of the Russians and their allies disgusting, he's furious. And I think that drives a new stage of this where the economic sanctions the U.S. has started become much tougher. And then you begin to see the real weakness of Putin's position.
Kim, do you think the administration was a little slow to recognize the gravity of this?
A little. I mean, the president talked about how this should be a wake-up call. The wake-up call should have been when Russia annexed the Crimea months ago. In fact, you could go back farther, maybe when Russia was rolling into Georgia in 2008. Putin, all the words that were used here today, thug, bully, all correct. But it's worse than that. He is a would-be czar. He has ambitions of having a greater Russia. And I think the worry about what we just heard here is that why would he respond to the West simply saying you need to be part of the solution? No one has done anything up until now. Look, back in June, all of the European leaders got together. We had the G7 summit in Brussels, and he was told that if he did not stop backing the separatists, there would be more sanctions. That deadline came and went. We're now in the middle of July. The United States finally did something on its own. The Europeans have done nothing. It's got to be more than just sanctions. There has to, in fact, be lethal aid to the Ukraine that will actually send the message to Russia that we will continue to fund them and support them and help them until he stops doing this. That's the only thing he's going to listen to.
So what is the administration thinking about on that front, Margaret?
Well, Secretary Kerry spoke to his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, yesterday and read him the Riot Act. But it's unclear whether that does anything, because up until now, all the diplomatic engagement at that level really hasn't been successful. Hillary Clinton told our colleague Charlie Rose the other day that lethal aid should be happening, that should go to the Ukrainian government. There's been support among policymakers of the Pentagon and State Department for that, but it's unclear whether the White House is moving from its position that they just don't want to go there quite yet. So I think sanctions and this idea of stepping up, freezing, I mean, for the Treasury to go and freeze dollar-denominated transactions for some big companies, Russian companies, is not insignificant. But to really have the full pressure has to come from the EU. I think also this is a test of whether Putin does have command and control over some of these paramilitaries on the ground. That border between Russia and Ukraine has been quite open. There are a lot of players in there with differing agendas. It's going to be interesting to see if he can get them to comply if he chooses to go that route.
There are reasons, obviously, practical reasons, Peter, that some of the Europeans are not as anxious to put these sanctions on. What will it take to convince them that there needs to be a unified front here?
Now, this could be very interesting. One of the players, one of the countries that's been most concerned about losing economic ties to Russia through all this has been the Netherlands. So this is a very interesting moment, right? They actually turn out to be one of Russia's largest trading partners. Russia's one of their largest trading partners. Royal Dutch Shell has a lot of interest there. They've not been interested in losing that business. The Prime Minister, as you say, now has a different dynamic. He's got a home country that has lost more people, as they like to say, than we did as a proportion on 9/11. And he has to go into the next round and explain what he thinks ought to be done. The European foreign ministers will meet on Tuesday, and it's hard to imagine if the Dutch come in there and say, we have to act strongly, that the rest of the Europeans don't find that a moral leadership that they have to follow on some level. But how far they're willing to go, it really is still up in the air.
And for Germany, David, it's all about energy and where they get their gas.
I did some reporting last week to look carefully at what's ahead this winter under different scenarios. And the problem is that Europe is going to face a very cold winter. Europe depends approximately 30% on Russia for its natural gas supplies, and there's no way in the short run that the United States can make up for that. We can reduce the impact, and I would hope that in the next few days there will be the most serious discussions about what if all Russian gas was cut off. What would we do? What would they do? How would they manage supplies and pipelines? Because unless you go into this knowing your contingency plan, you really are vulnerable to this energy weapon that Putin plays every chance he gets, and the Europeans are afraid of it.
Well, I mean, it's the European gas station.
It's the European gas station, and we got to find them a jerry can and another gas station down the road.
I mean, this gets to the question. The United States, I understand President Obama's reluctance, obviously, to, the issue of lethal force. But one thing that's just been obvious that we should have been doing from the beginning is unleashing the might and force of the American economy on Putin. And they should have said right away, we're going to do whatever we have to do to make sure that we are replacing, helping with European gas stores, talking about other trading relationships and things so that the Europeans themselves, who we are demanding do more, feel that they have the flexibility to push away Russia somewhat, and that they will still have the backstop of the United States and its economy behind them.
You know, beyond the diplomacy and maybe below the diplomacy, the scene of what is transpiring there out in that field, where you heard the secretary say drunken rebels were out there, you know, going through these bodies, and I guess the stench must have been almost unbearable. At least they've gotten them into a refrigerated area. But apparently, Margaret, there are reports they were also taking some of the black boxes, the recording devices, out of that. That is obviously of great concern to the administration.
It is, and the Ukrainian government has alleged that those black boxes, they say they have recordings of planning between militants on the ground and what they say is Russian help, saying get those black boxes back to Moscow. Don't let the monitors on the ground from a group called the OSCE get them first. But it's unclear whether that black box is really going to be the intelligence that tells us what we already presume here and what the secretary laid out, which is they do believe Russia is complicit, if not responsible. The Ukrainian government, however, is going far beyond that. They're saying Russian military servicemen basically helped pull the trigger here. And that's the sort of next step here in intelligence, is showing the level of Russian help. But the Ukrainian government's out there saying they know what's happening, and they're waiting for us all to sort of catch up to what they're
How
alleging.
much credibility did they put in those tapes that the Ukrainians have released? Because in one of those tapes, our Clarissa Ward, who had been there, you know, during the trouble in Crimea, she recognized, she says, the voice of one of those people as part of the crew that detained her crew and beat up their cameraman. And now he seems to be one of the people who's talking to the Russians about the shooting down of this aircraft.
Well, that's extraordinary. Well, I certainly haven't been waved away from the recordings by some U.S. officials, but that's not something that the U.S. is putting out there right now. That's a Ukrainian service recording, but they obviously also have their own agenda. And that's what's been so difficult in covering this Ukraine conflict, is so much of it has been extreme propaganda by both sides over the past 6 months. But with this incident, it's going to come down not to the propaganda, but to the specifics of what intelligence can lay out. And they're going to know with this level of weaponry what happened.
David, let's talk a little bit about what's going on in Israel and in the Gaza this morning. Obviously, the Secretary of State is about to get involved here, but as I was saying to Ambassador Endig, who does he talk to now? What's the best chance? Where do we go now to find some diplomatic solution and somebody who can have some control over Hamas?
Well, as Martin Indyk said on your show, the Secretary will head probably tonight to Cairo. And Egyptian-led diplomacy, working with the United States, trying to draw in Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian Authority leader, into a ceasefire process is the game. We've seen an interesting process of evolving war goals. When the Israelis started this operation, they talked about an extended period of quiet. They just wanted the missiles to stop. Then they began talking about closing off the tunnels, which were being used to attack Israeli forces. So that was a more aggressive push requiring ground forces. Now there's beginning to be talk about disarmament, and that's an ambitious war aim. And the truth is, if you try to get that by military force, you're in a nightmare. It's like invading Lebanon. I don't think the Israelis want to do that. So I'd have my eyes on a process going forward. Secretary Kerry will start with the Egyptians that would try to create a political foundation for the Palestinian Authority to begin to get a new government in place in Gaza that could make demilitarization work. Israel's going to have to keep pushing on the weapon sites right up to the end of whatever pre-diplomatic moment there is.
I mean, I think the problem, though, is that nobody does have control over Hamas, and also right now nobody wants to have control over Hamas. Egypt is very happy to have Israel dealing with this situation at the moment. They don't necessarily want to step into this. And so as much as everybody wants to talk about a ceasefire, I think the unfortunate reality is that the only way you make Hamas stop at the moment is that you go in and you so degrade them politically and militarily that they feel that they then have no other option but to come to the table. And that involves going in and destroying these tunnels, getting rid of the rocketry that's in there, and also targeted strikes on its military and political leadership. And Israel's tried this before in 2009 and 2012, went in for a week at a time, didn't finish that job, and now have had to go back in again. And hopefully this time they realize that you've got to actually finish it before there can be these talks.
I think the challenge here is you can't militarily defeat an idea. And I think one of the questions you put to Martin Indyk was really spot on to say, did the Israelis underestimate Hamas? Because what you've heard from U.S. officials, certainly from Egyptian officials up to this point, is how incredibly weak Hamas has gotten with the new al-Sisi government in Egypt. Because not only have they shut down tunnels, but they are arresting so many of the sort of brethren, the Muslim Brotherhood brethren of Hamas within their territory they can control. So it's not clear what credibilities the Egyptians actually have with Hamas, other than they can control access along the shared border. The Qataris are going to be a very important channel here, and they have been reaching out to Hamas in recent days, to the leader Mashal. But it's not clear, really, what that's all going to add up to, whether there's any diplomatic traction at this point yet.
You know, I think one of the great ironies here is when I was out there in May, and people were telling me on the Palestinian side, look, the reason that we've joined up with Hamas is because they're so weak. And that's the only reason they wanted to make this new arrangement with the Palestinian Authority, because they were so weak. Well, it appears to me they're driving the boat right now, Peter.
Well, they're driving the boat, but whether that's successful or not is hard to imagine. You know, they have shown that they can sneak into Israel proper with, captured Israel uniforms and do a lot of damage, and that has a disproportionate impact in some ways, even as they're taking a lot of damage on their side. I mean, we talk about Egypt. What's really interesting is how different it's changed in 2 years. 2 years ago, the last time this happened, President Obama sent Hillary Clinton, then the Secretary of State, and the person she was dealing with there was President Morsi. And as Mark was alluding to, in effect, that's the older brother of Hamas, Muslim Brotherhood. They had a friendship, a connection, an alliance, a relationship that Sisi does not. The current military-born government of Egypt is, in fact, on the opposite side. So when they proposed the ceasefire, they had nobody listening to them. And the question is whether that changes in the next few days.
Well, I think we have to leave it there. The efforts to get a ceasefire continue, but I don't think we're anywhere close to it right now. Well, thank you all very much. We'll be back in a moment with, I want to tell you about a new book is out about a legend here at CBS News.